The great river did not create civilization, it invited it, offering soil richer than memory and waters that spoke the language of movement. The first builders gathered where the wetlands rose and fell with the seasons, watching birds, fish, and floods teach them the rhythm of abundance. Corn arrived like a prophecy, turning small villages into large towns, and large towns into centers of power shaped by agriculture. People learned that by raising mounds, they could command the horizon, turning earth into platforms where leaders could see further than the common eye. The fields stretched outward like green oceans, feeding thousands who depended on discipline, cooperation, and a shared belief that the land could sustain them if organized carefully. Mississippian culture did not begin with a single moment. It rose slowly, like a mound built basket by countless hands. River routes pulled distant communities toward one another, forming networks that carried corn, pottery, ideas, stories, and obligations along muddy currents. Each settlement built plazas at its center, flat and precise, where ceremony, governance, and trade fused into a single heartbeat for the community. Mound building was not labor imposed by a king. It was a communal response to belief, a belief that height brought the people closer to the sacred. Elite residences rose atop platform mounds, their walls lined with symbolism that declared authority rooted in cosmology, not in conquest alone. Astronomical alignments shaped city layouts, turning plazas into calendars, and mounds into markers for solstice sunrises and equinox shadows. Trade widened across the continent, drawing in copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, and stone from the Appalachians, weaving a continental economy. Myths fused with politics, making leaders into mediators between sky and earth, responsible for ensuring balance through ceremony and governance. The Mississippi Valley began to fill with cities, each a node in a vast network stretching farther than any one community could govern alone. Yet among these cities, Cahokia rose differently, rising not only in height, but in ambition. Here, the Mississippian world found its greatest experiment in scale, complexity, and centralized authority. Here, the people pushed mounds higher, widened plazas larger, and built a city that changed the meaning of power in North America. Cahokia's beginnings were not quiet. They were the stirrings of a civilization that believed Earth could be shaped into monuments that would outlast those who built them. This was not a village becoming a town. It was a continent shifting toward urban life. The builders were not workers. They were citizens of a rising world shaped by corn, ceremony, and cosmology. Their city would soon become the largest in North America, north of Mexico, a beacon of power, innovation, and tension. Cahokia was not simply built, it was willed into existence by people who believed that the earth could be lifted to meet the sky. Cahokia rose where the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers braided into a fertile convergence, giving the city a lifeline of soil, fish, and trade. Monk's Mound emerged at the center of this world, a massive platform of 22 million cubic feet of earth, lifted basket by thousands of hands over generations. It was not a structure built quickly. It was a mountain of intention, a declaration that power could be raised from the ground itself. At its summit stood a great structure, part temple, part palace, where leaders mediated between the realms of sky and earth. From its height, elites looked across plazas the size of modern stadiums, watching as thousands gathered for ceremony, governance, and inspection. Woodhenge, a circle of upright timber posts, functioned as a solar observatory, aligning precisely with solstice and equinox sunrises that measured the sacred calendar. This was not superstition, it was astronomy engineered into the daily life of the city, binding agriculture, religion, and authority into one cosmic system. Neighborhoods spread outward in rings, their homes arranged around courtyards where families farmed maize, stored surplus, and carried out daily life beneath the watch of elites. Specialized districts housed artisans who shaped shell beads, copper plates, earthenware, stone tools, and ceremonial objects meant to strengthen alliances. Cahokia became the heartbeat of a regional network, drawing people from distant communities who carried their own traditions, merging them into a shared Mississippian identity. Mounds rose everywhere, forming artificial hills that reflected not geography, but social hierarchy, turning elevation into an index of authority. The city's scale required governance, leaders who could organize labor, manage food distribution, and coordinate religious cycles tied to astronomical observation. This leadership was not gentle. Cahokia's power rested on strict social stratification, where elites commanded and commoners obeyed in maintenance of cosmic balance. Political authority spread outward from Cahokia like ripples, influencing allied towns and distant villages who adopted mound building to align themselves with the city's prestige. Trade networks tightened, linking communities stretching from Oklahoma to Georgia, from Wisconsin to Florida, weaving a cultural continuity shaped by Mississippian ideology. Warriors trained beneath the gaze of the central mounds, preparing to defend trade routes and respond to political tensions that grew with population density. For centuries, the city thrived, growing to tens of thousands, rivaling medieval London and Paris in size and complexity. But beneath its monumental beauty, strains began to surface, strains from feeding a population larger than any the region had ever known. Climate fluctuations tightened the growing season, turning once reliable rains into unpredictable patterns that threatened the surplus. Construction of new mounds slowed, not because belief weakened, but because labor had to shift towards securing food and managing environmental stress. Political pressure increased as elites demanded more from farmers whose fields could no longer keep pace with climate shifts. Population density created tension between neighborhoods, as scarcity magnified conflict and competition inside the city. Cahokia's greatness was undeniable, but greatness built on fragile equilibrium could not last forever. The city stood at the peak of its power, unaware that the same earth it shaped would soon shape its fate in return. As Cahokia's population swelled, the land around it began to show signs of exhaustion, its soils stripped by relentless planting and timber cut faster than forests could recover. Fields expanded outward like spokes from a wheel, pushing farmers farther from the city and lengthening the lines that carried food back to the plazas. Deforestation altered rainfall patterns, turning seasonal floods unpredictable and eroding the delicate balance between river and field. Maize yields faltered, and surplus that once stabilized power became a source of anxiety measured in empty storage pits. Elites demanded renewed labor for mound maintenance and ritual cycles, believing ceremony could restore balance that food no longer guaranteed. Common households felt the pressure first, working longer seasons for diminishing returns while authority remained elevated above the struggle. Inequality deepened, visible not only in mound heights but in diet, health, and burial treatment across the city. Skeletal remains recorded stress, malnutrition, and injury, silent evidence of lives spent under an unforgiving system. Neighborhood tensions sharpened as scarcity made cooperation harder to sustain across thousands of residents. Defensive palisades were rebuilt and reinforced, not against distant enemies alone, but against unrest growing closer to home. Violence left marks in mass burials, hinting at episodes of conflict that shattered the illusion of cosmic order. Belief systems strained as ceremonies failed to deliver the stability they once promised, weakening the authority that bound city and cosmos together. Some families began to leave quietly, moving to smaller communities where food was closer and leadership less demanding. These departures did not signal collapse yet. They were pressure valves, releasing strain while the city struggled to adapt. But each departure reduced labor, trade, and loyalty, eroding the foundations that kept the monumental system upright. Climate shifts compounded human stress, bringing colder winters and shorter growing seasons that punished large centralized populations. Ritual calendars adjusted, but astronomy could not command rain or warmth on demand. The mounds still stood, but their meaning began to fracture as lived reality contradicted sacred promise. Political rivalries emerged within elite circles, competing visions clashing over how to restore balance and control. Factionalism turned plazas from gathering places into contested ground, where allegiance mattered as much as belief. As unity weakened, Cahokia's influence over distant communities faded, loosening the cultural glue that once held the network together. Peripheral towns began asserting independence, redirecting trade away from the center toward more stable local hubs. The great experiment in urban power had reached a tipping point, where size became vulnerability rather than strength. Cahokia did not fall in a single catastrophe. It frayed slowly, thread by thread, under the weight of its own ambition. What remained was a city still monumental in earth, but increasingly hollow in authority. The Mississippian world was about to change shape, carrying its knowledge outward even as its greatest city dimmed. As Cahokia's authority weakened, the river networks that once fed its power began carrying people away from the center. Families departed not as refugees of a single disaster, but as planners, responding to a future the city could no longer guarantee. The plazas emptied gradually, ceremonies grew smaller, and the labor that once lifted earth into monuments redirected toward survival elsewhere. Mounds remained standing, but their silence spoke louder than any ritual drum. Communities downstream along the Mississippi absorbed migrants who carried Mississippian knowledge without allegiance to Cahokia's elite. These migrants brought corn agriculture perfected for floodplains, mound-building techniques scaled to local needs, and ceremonial systems adaptable to smaller populations. City-centered hierarchy gave way to regional autonomy, where leadership depended on consensus, kinship, and control of local resources. Across the lower Mississippi Valley, towns reorganized around riverbends and fertile terraces, building new plazas that echoed Cahokia without copying it. Conflict followed movement, as groups competed for prime land once controlled by a distant center now unable to enforce peace. Fortified towns appeared more frequently, their palisades signaling a world where authority was negotiated through defense as much as ceremony. Warriors replaced priests as visible symbols of leadership in some regions, reflecting a shift from cosmic order to territorial survival. Trade persisted, but its purpose changed, moving goods between equals rather than feeding a dominant capital. Copper plates, shell beads, and ceremonial motifs continued to circulate, but now they reinforced alliances instead of hierarchy. Mississippian iconography fractured into regional styles, each adapting symbols of the old world to new political realities. The Mississippi River remained the great artery, but no single city controlled its pulse anymore. Climate stress continued, amplifying competition and pushing communities to disperse rather than What had once been an urban civilization transformed into a constellation of regional cultures, all descended from a shared Mississippian foundation. In this dispersal, the seeds of new nations took root, shaped by geography, conflict, and inherited knowledge. To the southeast, woodlands and river valleys nurtured communities that would become the ancestors of the Choctaw and Chickasaw. Along the Gulf Coast and interior southeast, Muskogee-speaking peoples organized towns that balanced agriculture with diplomacy and warfare. Farther west, in the Red River and Arkansas regions, Caddo communities emerged as heirs to Mississippian engineering, adapted to prairie and woodland margins. None of these societies were remnants of collapse. They were evolutions, carrying forward what worked and discarding what no longer served survival. The fall of Cahokia did not erase Mississippian civilization. It redistributed it across a broader landscape. Earthworks declined in scale, but knowledge endured in farming practices, ceremonial cycles, and social organization. The monuments stopped rising, but the culture continued walking. A civilization built on Earth had learned that Earth could also demand release. The spread that followed was not retreat, but transformation driven by necessity and wisdom, earned through failure. Mississippian culture no longer belonged to one city. It belonged to the river valleys and peoples who carried it forward. As the great city faded, its people did not vanish into myth. They reorganized into societies better suited to a changed world. Along the lower Mississippi and Tombigbee rivers, communities refined agriculture to match smaller populations and shifting flood cycles. Here, the ancestors of the Choctaw shaped towns that emphasized kinship, consensus, and resilience over monumental display. Their leadership rested not on towering mounds, but on the ability to manage cornfields, ceremonies, and alliances in balance with the land. Nearby, the Chickasaw forged a different response, emphasizing mobility, defense, and strategic control of river corridors. Their towns stood ready for conflict, reflecting lessons learned from Cahokia's vulnerabilities when size outpaced security. To the east and south, Muskogee-speaking peoples organized into networks of towns linked by diplomacy and shared ritual rather than centralized authority. These communities balanced war and peace through councils that echoed Mississippian governance without repeating its hierarchy. Plazas remained central, but they served as meeting grounds for equals rather than stages for elites elevated above the people. Ceremonial cycles continued, tied to planting, harvest, and the movement of celestial bodies that still governed agricultural success. Mound building did not disappear entirely. It adapted, shrinking in scale to match local needs and labor realities. Earthworks now marked sacred spaces and burial grounds, not seats of political dominance. To the west, Caddo communities emerged along the Red River system, blending Mississippian knowledge with prairie and woodland traditions. Their towns became centers of trade and ceremony, carefully placed to control movement across broad landscapes without demanding urban density. Caddo leadership emphasized diplomacy, hospitality, and long-distance exchange, drawing strength from connections rather than concentration. Across all these regions, the memory of Cahokia lingered not as a goal to recreate, but as a warning against imbalance. People remembered how abundance could become pressure, how monuments could demand more than the land could give. Conflict did not vanish, but it localized, fought over territory and resources without dragging entire civilizations into crisis. The Mississippian worldview survived in symbols, myths, and agricultural practices passed from elders to children. Corn remained sacred, not simply as food, but as a reminder that human power depends on soil, rain, and restraint. Rivers continued to guide settlement choices, trade routes, and seasonal movement, just as they had guided the rise of the first cities. The spread of Mississippian culture became quieter, less visible in earthworks, but more durable in social structure. Civilization no longer announced itself through towering mounds. It lived in villages that could endure stress without breaking. What outsiders would later misinterpret as decline was in truth a recalibration towards sustainability. The Mississippian world had learned from its own excess and reshaped itself accordingly. From the shadow of Monk's Mound arose nations that valued balance over spectacle. Their cities were smaller, their politics more flexible, and their survival more certain. The legacy of Cahokia endured not in ruins alone, but in living peoples who carried its lessons forward. The river still flowed, and along its banks, civilization continued no longer concentrated, but spread across the continent in quieter strength. Time moved on, but the rivers never forgot the hands that shaped their banks into fields and cities. The great mounds remained, not as abandoned failures, but as witnesses to a civilization that learned its limits and chose survival over collapse. Descendants carried Mississippian knowledge into new centuries, reshaping it to meet forests, floodplains, and political realities that no longer favored massive cities. Choctaw towns organized around kinship and ceremony, proving that strengths could live without stone monuments. Chickasaw communities guarded corridors of movement and trade, turning mobility into security in a world where conflict never disappeared. Muskogee towns formed confederacies of their own, councils bound by ritual and law that echoed Mississippian governance without repeating its rigid hierarchy. Caddo centers became diplomatic anchors, hosting trade and ceremony across broad regions where balance mattered more than dominance. Corn remained sacred, anchoring identity in soil and season rather than in earthworks raised toward the sky. Plazas stayed central, not as stages for elites, but as places where people met as participants in shared responsibility. The old symbols endured in pottery, shellwork, and ritual language, carrying cosmology forward without the need for monumental scales. When Europeans arrived, they encountered nations shaped by Mississippian inheritance, even if they could no longer see the cities that birthed it. Colonizers mistook smaller towns for simplicity, never realizing they were facing societies refined by centuries of adaptation. War, disease, and removal would again test these nations, but the lesson of Cahokia had already been learned. Concentration imbibed vulnerability, while distribution offered endurance. The people adapted again, just as their ancestors had done when the great city loosened its grip on the river. Mississippian civilization did not end. It changed form, embedding itself into living nations instead of standing frozen in earth. Today, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee, and Caddo communities still carry the logic of the mounds in governance, ceremony, and relationship to land. They do not rebuild Cahokia because it does not need rebuilding. Its lesson already lives within them. The mounds teach restraint, reminding the present that abundance without balance becomes pressure. They teach that cities rise, but cultures survive only when they listen to land and people equally. Modern archaeologists measure soil layers and post holes, but living descendants carry knowledge that cannot be excavated. That knowledge lives in councils, planting cycles, stories, and ceremonies that still bind people to river and earth. The Mississippi still flows past Cahokia's silent earthworks, carrying memory downstream into every community shaped by its past. Civilizations do not vanish when monuments fall. They vanish only when lessons are forgotten. The Mississippian world remembered, its people endured, and its story continues not in mounds alone, but in nations that still stand beside the rivers that once built cities from soil. They built cities from earth, shaping soil into power, ceremony, and responsibility. They raised mounds, knowing that height demanded balance, not dominance. They aligned their lives with rivers, stars, and seasons that could not be commanded. They learned that abundance carries weight, and that pressure follows growth without restraint. When the land began to speak through scarcity, they listened. When the river demanded release, they moved. They chose survival over monuments, continuity over spectacle. They carried corn, stories, and law farther than any city wall could reach. From the shadow of Cahokia, new nations rose without forgetting what came before. They governed with memory instead of stone. They planted with patience instead of excess. They learned that civilization does not live in earthworks alone, but in the choices people make when power fades. The mounds remain as witnesses, silent but honest. The rivers remain as teachers, always moving forward. The people remain as proof that collapse is not the end of a story. It is a turning. It is a lesson. It is a continuation carried by those who remember. Follow to keep the stories of the land, the rivers, and the people alive.